Hi, I'm John,
I'm Traci.
and this is Your History, Mentor Public Library's podcast or video podcast or whatever, devoted to historical stuff done by our two resident history nerds. So this is episode number 2, and I think we're both talking about things that are kind of close to our hearts. The thing I wanted to start out with today, I just reread this gigantic book, which is Ron Chernow's biography of Alexander Hamilton. Lots of people know about this book because it was the basis for the Lin-Manuel Miranda musical about the life of Hamilton. By the way, a fabulous production in its own right. I mean, not surprisingly, given all the accolades that it's won, but I give real props to Lin-Manuel Miranda because he really did the research, particularly by reading this enormous book. It runs to more than 700 pages. And it's not only the state of the art on Alexander Hamilton right now, but it's going to be the state of the art about Alexander Hamilton for the foreseeable future. I mean, I can't imagine that somebody's going to come up with material that Ron Chernow didn't go through in compiling this enormous book. And it goes into everything. I'm a little Hamilton obsessed. I think that for my money, he's the most interesting of the founding fathers. It's interestingly, I've just been reading a biography of John Jay, who's one of the least interesting of the founding fathers, although he was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But he was in the introduction to the biography of John Jay, the guy who wrote it is commenting on the fact that he often gets left out of the lists of the important founding fathers, and mentions that one important list of the sort of 8 most important founding fathers didn't include John Jay, but did include Aaron Burr, who would pretty much be forgotten if he hadn't shot Alexander Hamilton. But in any case, this book, it's really beautifully written. Now, this is one of those things that those of us who are like kind of history obsessed, it's a hard sell for us to people who are not so inclined, because it's this thick. I mean, it's a big book. I listened to the audiobook of it one time while I was preparing to give a talk about Hamilton, and it's like 28 discs long or something like that, something completely absurd. But it really repays the reader who's adventurous enough to get into it, because it's just got all kinds of really what I would call funny stories about Alexander Hamilton. My favorite being, and this people know well, is the story about him getting sort of honey trapped by a woman named Maria Reynolds and her husband, who then tried to blackmail him, and did blackmail him, in fact, not only with threatening to publish stories of his infidelity, but also her husband then published a pamphlet claiming that he had engaged in sort of financial irregularities when he was Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton then responded by publishing a 110-page pamphlet or something like that, in which he argued that he was not an embezzler or whatever, but he was an adulterer, which, if you know anything about Alexander Hamilton, is the sort of Hamilton to a T. I mean, the guy just couldn't leave it alone. A normal person would have just said, I've already been clear to these allegations years ago. I'm not gonna get into it. That just wasn't Alexander Hamilton. So I just absolutely love this book. And as we go on a little further, I'm going to talk a little more about Ron Chernow and other things that he's written, but I don't want to take up all the oxygen. So I think you have something related.
Yes. So I'm reading The Secret Token, Myth, Obsession, and Search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke. So still early American colonial. It was founded and chartered by Sir Walter Raleigh. And there were actually 2 colonies. There was one in 1585 and one in 1587. The one in 1585 failed after only a year. So Sir Francis Drake was coming back from one of his missions and actually rescued many of the colonists. They had a horrible relationship with the Native Americans that were around there, since practically a couple months after they got there, to the point where it was really unsafe for them to live there, and they probably would have all been killed if they had stayed. So it was really lucky that Sir Francis Drake actually came and rescued them while he was on his way back from one of the missions. He was actually supposed to take them to the Chesapeake Bay, but they were unable to go because of a hurricane. They had already learned that the Chesapeake Bay was a much better place to go to form a colony. And later, that's actually around the area where Jamestown was founded in 1607. But they were unable to go at that point because of a hurricane. So they went all the way back to England, and it took 2 years for them to charter another colony. And so that one was done by John White. And it was their goal to originally go to the Chesapeake. but they stopped to look for the 15 men that were left behind in the 1585 journey because they left so abruptly that some of the men didn't even make it on the ship to leave. So they looked for them. And then it was announced that they all had to get off. None of them were going in the Chesapeake. They couldn't stay. They weren't going to take them there. So they had to stay on Roanoke Island off the coast of the Outer Banks. There was no way where else to go. And it was actually horrible weather to get there. So each time there were kind of shipwreck disasters on sandbars. Each time they tried to go there, it was almost like telling them, you shouldn't be going here. Like, this is not a safe place to form a colony. Please do not come here. But they were left there. And John White didn't really fight with his superiors or the people that were taking them on the ship. He didn't argue at all. Even though his daughter was 8 months pregnant, almost giving birth to a child, and really needed a safer place to be able to have a family. But he did not seem to care whatsoever. This book also talks about several theories. As we know, John White had to go back to England to get supplies. And then he came back 3 years later. He could not come back right away because all ships were locked in England. There was a naval battle. Some of you may know the battle, the Spanish Armada between Elizabeth I and Philip II. And so until the battle was won, nobody could leave the ports at all in England. Every naval vessel had to be used for that battle, which England won, by the way, massively. And so he eventually came back and none of the colonists were there. They all said there was only CRO and Croatoan carved on a tree in a fence post. But John White didn't seem interested in seeing what happened to the colonists. He kind of was like, okay, I guess we could go down to where the Croatoan tribe is. I bet they're there. We could go down there, but there was a hurricane and there was bad weather, as there always is in the Outer Banks in the summer. Right? Yeah. It's hurricane season. So they weren't able to make the trip. But everybody wonders. So in the book, Andrew Lawler talks about his journeys with people who have theories, historians, amateurs alike. He talks about the Dare stones, which a lot of people label to be a hoax, about series of stones that talk about what happened to different people in Roanoke colony. There's one that they're more interested in, one by Eleanor Dare, allegedly, that talks about how she was killed in an attack and her family died and many of the people in the colony perished. But there are theories that some of them at least survived and merged with Native American tribes. So he's talking to all different types of people and learning about what happened or didn't happen. None of these theories which can be 100% proven. So it's a really interesting book. It's a mystery I've been interested in for half my life. So I was really excited to read about. I would recommend it. There's a lot of intrigue. There's some talk about maps. There's a little bit of archaeology, if you like that, in addition to history.
Yeah, it sounds great. I have a sort of fascination with that too, because I spent part of my youth in Southern Maryland, and Maryland was settled by the Baltimore family, who were sort of, I think, Catholic refugees. At that point, Catholicism was not going over very well in Great Britain, so a lot of Catholics wanted to move somewhere else. And I mean, I know that a lot of Maryland, especially Southern Maryland, is very Catholic now, so it doesn't surprise me that it was then. But things seem to go over in the Baltimore colony like rather better. They went over better in Jamestown too. As a matter of fact, like I have very fond memories of being, we used to go to, when I was in like third grade, fourth grade, we used to go. If you live in Southern Maryland, you get taken to Monticello and Mount Vernon and Fort McHenry, and we got taken to Jamestown, which I remember was absolutely baking hot, but really, really interesting. But yeah, that sounds like a good sort of take on something that there's a lot of kind of fascination with. I mean, I remember seeing an episode of In Search Of when I was about 10, like about the disappearance of the colony and what might have happened to them. But of course, it's one of those things where, there's a lot of things back there that our eyes just can't see. So we're just never going to know exactly what happened to those people unless like somebody wrote it down and buried it somewhere and it eventually comes to light.
Right. And talking about Jamestown, Powhatan, the Jamestown colonists actually asked him do you know anything? And he said, well, I had about some people, some English people murdered, but they're not sure which Roanoke colony they're referring to. They're not sure if he's referring to 1585 or 1587. And they did come across a few people that had gray eyes, which could mean European, but also Native Americans had a lot of albinoism in them. So you can't really know what it's actually coming from.
Right. Interesting. Switching gears just slightly, but back to the Ron Chernow thing. Rereading Hamilton encouraged me to read some of Chernow's other books. Chernow has written a bunch of things. He's written a sort of family biography of the Warburg financial dynasty. He wrote a book about Rockefeller. He wrote a biography of George Washington. But the thing really to read, and okay, once again, I'm going to show everybody an absolutely gigantic book. This biography of Ulysses S. Grant, which came out, I think, in 2017. Yeah, I wouldn't even say the page count. It's bigger than the Hamilton book. And it's really one of those things that challenges your wrist. Every now and then somebody will come in and want a large print version of this. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's got to be about 5,000 pages long. But it's a really fascinating book. And it really illustrates a lot of interesting stuff about Grant. And the reason I sort of am fascinated with this is that Grant is one of these figures in American history who was really only good at one thing. He was above average soldier. As a matter of fact, during the Civil War, he was an excellent soldier, but not because he was sort of tactically brilliant. He just had this sort of tactical idea, which none of the other Union generals had, which was that if you get beat today, go and attack tomorrow because you have a lot more people and resources than the Southerners do. So there's a point around the time of the Battle of Spotsylvania in the Overland Campaign, which really sort of led to the end of the war. Battle of Spotsylvania is one of the 5 most costly battles in the history of the Civil War. And at the end of it, he wrote to, I think, the Secretary of War, who I think at the time was Stanton, and said, I intend to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer, which if you were a Southerner and heard about this, which I rather doubt, but, would be very chilling because he had realized the sort of logic of the conflict, which was we have more people and we have more stuff. So even if we take, I think at the Battle of Spotsylvania, the Union suffered something like 18,000 casualties. The South suffered 13,000 casualties, but that was a lot bigger proportion of what the Southerners had, of what the Confederacy had, of what Lee's army was in total. So, at a certain point, there was a certain point earlier on, I think this was after some costly engagement out in the West prior to the siege of Vicksburg, when people came to Lincoln and said, you've got to get rid of Grant. And Lincoln said, I can't spare this man. He fights, which is once again what Grant was very good at. He was terrible at everything else. He tried his work as a sort of I think he ran a leather goods store at one point that failed. He tried farming. He failed at that. Although, if I recall correctly, he did manumit his slaves, which, I think most people don't know that he did that. He was not a terribly good president, unfortunately. He was president at a time that it was going to be very difficult. I mean, this was a very fraught time in the United States. But the one other thing, by the way, that he did well was toward the end of his life, when he was suffering from throat cancer and had once again was in pretty desperate financial straits, he decided to write his memoirs. These are the personal memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant, which we have several copies of at the library, although I think only in this is the most recent edition, or a very recent edition. And it's absolutely fantastic. It's one of the best military history books ever written. He goes through all the campaigns that he was involved in exhaustive detail. It's really beautifully written. It's one of the most beautifully written books I've ever read. I mean, it's remarkable. The guy was not like a trained writer. And interestingly too, so at one point my grandfather read this book, my grandfather, who was a tank commander in the Second World War and an officer in the US Army. And he sent me when he finished the book, he sent it to me with a letter that basically said, I really wish that in my time in the Army, people were so calm under fire as they appear to have been, in Grant's tongue. Now, of course, Grant is sort of talking about it at a distance of years and probably trying to cast people he respected in a good light or whatever, but it's still absolutely fascinating book and a really great book to read because you can read histories of what happened in the Civil War written by people now, but Grant was there at all these places and he knew exactly, he had an encyclopedic memory for the things that had happened. I mean, he had his unit diaries and stuff like that, so he knew, he could sort of look up things, I suppose. But but it's just an absolutely fantastic book by somebody who really was right in the middle of some of the most important events in all of American history.
Yes, I love when people involved in history write it down. And Ron Chernow has inspired a lot of fiction too. One which I read about Eliza Hamilton, which was a really, really excellent book. And a lot of it goes about her relationship with Hamilton and her feelings on different issues they encompassed over their lives. So
Yeah.
she outlived by like 50 years too.
Right. I mean, Chernow writes a lot about her. Yeah, I'm really interested to read that book just because Elizabeth Schuyler is a really fascinating person in and of herself. I mean, she came from one of the two sort of dynastic families in colonial revolutionary era New York. The Schuylers were, along with the Clintons, one of the biggest, most prominent political families. And her marriage to Hamilton was sort of Hamilton's entree in a way into the upper levels of politics in a way, so that he becomes prominent enough then to be the Secretary of the Treasury, becomes prominent enough then to be, prior to that, obviously, at the Constitutional Convention in 1787 in Philadelphia. But she's a really interesting figure too. I mean, she came from a really fascinating family, and I'm not surprised that someone would look to Chernow's biography of Hamilton for a lot of interesting information about her, but also about how her and Alexander Hamilton related to each other.
Yeah, it talks about their entire story for the whole marriage from start to finish, which is really interesting. And it talks about the whole Maria of Reynolds thing, which lasts like tons of the book, and she's still angry for like so many pages, but then she finally kind of gets over it. But my favorite character, aside from Eliza, is actually her father, Philip Schuyler. So.
Oh yeah, I bet that would be interesting too.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how her father's career was and how it impacted Alexander's as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would have loved to be like a fly on the wall at the Hamilton kitchen table the night that Alexander sat down and was like, "Look, honey, I've been scurrilously accused of misusing public funds or whatever, and I've written this pamphlet that's convincingly, refuted all these accusations against me. It shows that I'm like an adulterer, but I'm definitely not I didn't engage in financial misdeeds." And like, what must the conversation have gone like after that?
Well, people sometimes wonder why he didn't become president, and that was kind of the final nail in the coffin for that.
Yeah.
So.
This is an interesting thing about Hamilton. I'll just sort of end with this, that he was kind of out of influence toward the end of his life. And so was Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr challenging him to this duel was Burr's way, so he thought, of trying to recoup his political fortunes. And then he ends up killing Hamilton, which destroyed both of them, although Hamilton in a more immediate sense, i.e. it killed him. But Burr then, had to essentially be a fugitive because shooting people, even in the context of a duel, is not legal. I mean, it's one of the most hair-raising miscalculations in American history. Like, Aaron Burr, like, really? What did you think was going to happen? Like, people just like, oh yeah, well, bad luck for Alexander Hamilton, but hey, want some high government office now?
Yeah, and he could have done a lot more with it. I mean, he was vice president, even though it was like not what people wanted, but he still had it. He still had potential. And then after that, it's just like, nope, no one's going to like you anymore. You have to run and get away from here. You're exiled.
That was really the end of the story.
Yes.
Well, that's all we have for this time around. We'll be back next month with more stuff about history. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for coming to Stuff at Mentor Public Library.